The Zephyrian Empire had conquered 43 star systems in the past century. Their military machine was a work of art, precision, and overwhelming force. Admiral Kextar stood on the command bridge of the dreadnought Crimson Fong, watching the blue-green planet slowly rotate on the main display. The third planet in this system showed clear signs of civilization, but their initial scans revealed something puzzling. Admiral, the electromagnetic signatures from the planet are unusual, reported Commander Vishka, his scales rippling with uncertainty. They appear to be using primitive radio waves for communication, but there are also traces of more advanced technology. Kextar's four eyes narrowed as he studied the data. The Zephyrians had encountered many species during their expansion across the galaxy. Some were advanced, requiring significant military effort to subdue. Others were barely past the Stone Age, falling within days to superior firepower. This planet seemed to fall somewhere in between, which made it interesting. What is their military capability assessment? Kextar asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had personally overseen the conquest of dozen worlds. Minimal, sir. We detect nuclear weapons, but they appear to be primitive fission-based devices. Some electromagnetic pulse capability. Basic projectile weapons. Their space presence is laughably small, a few satellites, and what appears to be a small research station. Vishka paused, checking his readings again. Sir, they don't even appear to have a unified planetary government. Multiple nation-states with separate military forces. The Admiral's mandibles clicked in amusement. A divided planet with primitive weapons? This would be easier than the conquest of Altair, 7, where the insectoid inhabitants had at least possessed plasma technology. Initiate standard conquest protocol, Kextar ordered. Launch observation probes. I want detailed intelligence on population centers, military installations, and resource deposits. Prepare the invasion fleet for deployment in 72 standard hours. The bridge crew moved with practiced efficiency. The Zephyrian military had perfected the art of planetary conquest through centuries of expansion. The pattern was always the same. Overwhelming orbital bombardment of military targets, deployment of ground forces to major population centers, and swift elimination of any organized resistance. Most species surrendered within a week once they understood the futility of fighting back. 3 days later, the invasion began exactly as planned. Kextar positioned his fleet in high orbit, well beyond the range of any primitive weapons the planet's inhabitants might possess. The opening bombardment was swift and surgical. Every major military installation they had identified was reduced to molten slag within the first hour. Nuclear missile silos, air bases, naval yards, command centers, all eliminated with precise energy beam strikes from orbit. Phase 1 complete, Admiral Vishka reported. All identified military targets have been neutralized. Enemy resistance appears to be scattered and disorganized. Kextar nodded approvingly. The orbital strikes had been textbook perfect. Now came Phase 2, ground deployment to secure major population centers and establish control points. He activated the communication array and began broadcasting the standard surrender ultimatum in the planet's major languages. Inhabitants of the third planet, his voice boomed across every radio and television frequency on the world below. I am Admiral Kextar of the Zephyrian Empire. Your military forces have been destroyed. Your resistance is futile. Surrender now and accept integration into the Empire, and your species will be allowed to continue existing as productive citizens. Resist and face complete annihilation. The response from the planet was unexpected. Instead of the usual panicked communications between governments desperately trying to negotiate surrender terms, there was an eerie silence on official channels. But across thousands of civilian frequencies, a different kind of communication was taking place. Short, coded bursts of data. Encrypted transmissions that bounced between seemingly random points across the globe. Sir, the communications officer called out, his voice tight with confusion. We're intercepting massive amounts of encrypted traffic, but it's not coming from any government facilities. It appears to be civilian in nature, but the encryption is sophisticated. Kekstar Frolvnid. Civilian encryption? That was unusual. Most conquered species relied on their military for secure communications, and those systems were typically the first targets of the opening bombardment. Deploy the first wave, he ordered. Secure the major population centers as planned. The Zephyrian dropships descended through the atmosphere like falling stars, their heat shields glowing orange as they cut through the air. Each ship carried 200 elite Zephyrian shock troopers, armed with the best weapons and armor the Empire could provide. Their powered exoskeletons enhanced their already formidable natural strength, while their plasma rifles could cut through most known materials. The first landing zones were carefully selected. Major cities with millions of inhabitants who would serve as examples to the rest of the planet. The dropships touched down in central plazas and parks, disgorging their cargo of armed soldiers who immediately began establishing perimeters and setting up control points. In the city the humans called New York, Captain Zekmon led his troops out of their transport and onto the strange alien concrete. The indigenous population had mostly fled the area, standard behavior when faced with an overwhelming military force. A few brave or foolish individuals remained hidden in buildings, watching from windows. Zekmon ignored them. Civilians were not a threat. Perimeter established, he reported through his helmet communicator, beginning Phase 2 deployment. But as his troops spread out through the urban landscape, something felt wrong. The city was too quiet, too empty. Intelligence reports had indicated this was one of the planet's most densely populated areas, but the streets were completely deserted. Even accounting for civilian evacuation, there should have been some signs of recent habitation, some evidence of hasty departure. Captain, Sergeant Yextal's voice crackled through the comm. You need to see this. Zekmon found his sergeant standing beside what appeared to be a civilian vehicle, one of the wheeled transports the planet's inhabitants favored. But as he approached, he realized it wasn't abandoned. It had been deliberately positioned to block part of the street. Sir, look at this placement. Yextal pointed with one clawed hand. This vehicle is positioned to funnel movement toward that intersection. And see those marks on the road surface? Those aren't random. Zekmon activated his armor's tactical analysis system and immediately saw what his sergeant meant. The seemingly random placement of abandoned vehicles, construction barriers, and even scattered debris formed a subtle but deliberate pattern. Anyone moving through this area would naturally be guided along specific routes. A trap. Zekmon mused, but that seemed unlikely. Their orbital reconnaissance had shown no sign of organized military resistance remaining on the planet. His question was answered 30 seconds later when the first shots rang out. The sound was sharp and distinctive, the crack of chemically propelled projectiles rather than the whine of energy weapons. But the accuracy was unnaturally precise. 3 of his soldiers dropped immediately, their armor penetrated by projectiles that struck exactly at the joints where the protection was weakest. Contact! Contact! Zekmon shouted into his comm as his remaining troops scrambled for cover, taking fire from unknown positions. But even as he called out the warning, he realized something disturbing. He couldn't see the enemy. The shots seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. His armor's thermal sensors showed no heat signatures. His electromagnetic detection systems revealed no energy weapon discharges. Yet his soldiers continued to fall with mechanical precision. Sergeant, can you identify firing positions? He demanded. Negative, sir. I'm showing no thermal signatures, no movement, nothing on any sensors. Another soldier dropped, then another. Each shot was perfectly placed, striking the weak points in their armor with surgical accuracy. Whoever was firing at them had studied Zephyrian equipment extensively and knew exactly where to aim. Zekmon activated his communicator to contact the fleet. Command, this is Ground Team Alpha. We are taking casualties from an unknown enemy using projectile weapons. Request immediate orbital support. The response came quickly from Admiral Kextar himself. "Understood, Captain. Transmit your coordinates, and we will provide precision strikes on any enemy positions." "Sir, that's the problem," Zekmon replied, ducking as another shot sparked off the concrete near his head. "We cannot identify enemy positions. They appear to be using some form of advanced concealment technology." There was a pause before the Admiral's voice returned, heavy with skepticism. "Captain, you are reporting that primitive beings armed with projectile weapons are defeating Zephyrian shock troopers equipped with advanced armor and sensors." "Sir," Zekmon began, but his words were cut off as an explosion erupted in the middle of his formation. Not the clean energy burst of plasma grenade, but the dirty, chemical blast of some primitive explosive device. It had been placed with perfect timing and positioning to cause maximum casualties. In the span of 10 minutes, half of his 200-soldier unit was either dead or wounded, and still he had not seen a single enemy combatant. "All units fall back to the landing zone," he ordered. "Immediate evacuation." But as his surviving troops began their withdrawal, they discovered another problem. The route back to their dropship had been blocked, not by some massive barrier or energy field, but by the simple expedient of disabled vehicles, collapsed building facades, and debris strategically placed to make passage impossible for their bulky powered armor. "Sir," Yextal's voice carried a note of panic. "The LZ is compromised. Our dropship is gone." Zekmon switched to his armor's high-magnification optical zoom and confirmed his sergeant's report. Their transport had been destroyed, not by orbital bombardment or heavy weapons, but by what appeared to be simple chemical explosives placed with precision against critical components. "Command," he transmitted desperately. "Ground Team Alpha requests immediate extraction. Our transport is destroyed, and we are surrounded by an enemy force of unknown size using advanced concealment technology." Admiral Kextar's response came after a long pause. "Captain, our orbital sensors show no large enemy formations in your area. There are no energy signatures indicating advanced concealment devices. What exactly are you facing down there?" Before Zekmon could answer, a new sound reached his ears. It was subtle at first, a rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from the sewers beneath the street. Then, another sound from a different direction, and another. "They're in the underground tunnels," he realized aloud. "They're using the planet's infrastructure against us." The tapping sounds grew closer, more numerous. And then, for the first time since the engagement began, Zekmon caught sight of the enemy. The figure appeared for less than 2 seconds at the edge of his vision, a bipedal form in mottled clothing that seemed to shift and blend with its surroundings even as he watched. The being moved with fluid precision, fired a single shot that dropped another of his soldiers, and vanished again before he could bring his weapons to bear. But in that brief glimpse, Zektar had seen enough to understand that everything they thought they knew about this planet was wrong. The being had been carrying what appeared to be a primitive kinetic weapon, but the way it moved, the tactical awareness it displayed, the precision of its shot, this was no primitive savage. "Command," he transmitted, his voice grim. "I need to speak with Admiral Kextar immediately. We have a significant problem." As the surviving members of his unit tried to establish a defensive perimeter in the alien city, Captain Zekmon realized that the Zephyrian Empire might have finally encountered something they had never faced before, an enemy that was not just willing to fight back, but capable of turning their own advantages against them. The humans, it seemed, had been preparing for this day far longer than anyone had imagined. And as more of his soldiers fell to precisely aimed shots from an enemy that refused to show itself, Zekmon began to understand that everything the Empire thought it knew about warfare was about to be challenged by a species that had spent its entire existence perfecting the art of killing its own kind. The invasion of the third planet was not going according to plan. Admiral Kextar paced the command bridge of the Crimson Fong, his 4 eyes reviewing the tactical displays with growing unease. In the 6 hours since the first landing forces had deployed, he had lost contact with 12 of his 18 ground units. The remaining 6 were trapped in defensive positions, unable to advance or retreat, slowly being whittled down by an enemy that seemed to materialize from nowhere, strike with lethal precision, then vanish again. Sir, Commander Vishka approached cautiously. We've received an encrypted transmission from the planet's surface. It's addressed to you personally. From our forces? Kextar asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. No, sir. From the indigenous population. They're using our own communication protocols. That was impossible. The Zephyrian military communication systems were encrypted with quantum-level security that had never been broken by any species they had encountered. Yet somehow, the primitive inhabitants of this backwater planet had not only intercepted their signals, but had cracked the encryption. Put it through, he ordered. The main display flickered, and suddenly, Kextar found himself looking at a human face. The being appeared to be male, middle-aged by the standards of its species, with graying hair and calm, intelligent eyes. He was wearing what appeared to be a simple civilian garment, sitting in what looked like an ordinary room. Admiral Kextar, the human said, his voice carrying a subtle accent that the universal translator struggled to interpret. My name is General Marcus Harrison, United Earth Defense Command. I believe we need to talk. Kextar's mandibles clicked in surprise. A general? Their intelligence had indicated this planet had no unified military command structure. Yet this being was speaking with the authority of someone accustomed to wielding significant power. I am Admiral Kextar of the Zephyrian Empire, he replied formally. Your forces attacked my soldiers without provocation. This is an act of war against the Empire. The human's expression didn't change. Admiral, you bombarded our planet from orbit and deployed invasion forces in our cities. If anyone committed an act of war, it was you. But I'm not calling to debate the legalities of your invasion attempt. I'm calling to offer you the opportunity to leave our system peacefully. The sheer audacity of the statement left Kextar momentarily speechless. This primitive being was offering him the chance to leave? The Zephyrian Empire had conquered dozens of worlds. No species had ever been in a position to offer them terms. You seem to misunderstand the situation, Kextar said slowly. Your military installations have been destroyed. Your forces are scattered and hiding like cowards. I have a full invasion fleet in orbit around your world. You are in no position to make demands. General Harrison leaned back in his chair, and for the first time, Kextar noticed something unsettling about the human's expression. It wasn't fear or desperation. It was pity. Admiral, let me ask you a question. In your conquest of other worlds, how long did it typically take for organized resistance to collapse once you achieved orbital superiority? The question was so unexpected that Kextar found himself answering honestly. 72 hours, standard. Most species surrender within that time frame once they realize their situation is hopeless. And how many of your previous conquest targets had spent the last 60 years preparing specifically for an invasion by a technologically superior alien force? Kextar felt a chill run down his spine. What do you mean? Harrison stood up and walked to a window. Through it, Kextar could see the skyline of a human city, but something was wrong with the view. He realized with growing alarm that the window was underground. This human was broadcasting from a facility buried deep beneath the surface. Admiral, let me explain something about human history. For the past century, our scientists have known that intelligent life likely existed elsewhere in the galaxy. We've been listening to radio signals from space for decades. We've been preparing for this day since before my grandfather was born. The general gestured towards something outside the camera's view, and the transmission split to show a new feed. Kextar found himself looking at what appeared to be a massive underground complex, filled with humans in military uniforms working at sophisticated equipment. This is just one of 47 identical command centers located around the globe. Each one is hardened against orbital bombardment, buried under 200 meters of reinforced concrete and stone, with independent power, communication, and life support systems. We built them specifically to survive exactly the kind of attack you just launched. Kextar stared at the display in growing disbelief. The level of preparation being displayed was unlike anything they had encountered in previous conquests. Most species simply weren't capable of that kind of long-term strategic planning. Your orbital strikes were very impressive, Harrison continued conversationally. You destroyed every military installation we wanted you to destroy. Every base, every missile silo, every command center that we had deliberately made visible to orbital reconnaissance. You eliminated all of our conventional forces exactly as we expected you would. That's impossible, Vishkal whispered, but Kextar held up a hand to silence him. You see, Admiral, humans have been fighting wars for our entire recorded history. We understand something that you apparently don't. Conventional forces are often more effective as bait than as actual fighting forces. While you were congratulating yourself on destroying our visible military assets, our real forces remained hidden. The transmission shifted again, showing what appeared to be a natural cave system. But as the camera moved deeper into the caves, Kextar realized they had been extensively modified. Miles of tunnels connected natural caverns that had been converted into armories, barracks, and command posts. The scale of the operation was staggering. We learned something important from studying your previous conquests, Harrison said. You always follow the same pattern. Orbital bombardment, then deployment of ground forces to secure major population centers. It's an effective strategy when facing conventional military opposition. But it has significant weaknesses when facing an enemy that refuses to fight conventionally. As if to emphasize his point, another report came in from the planet's surface. Captain Zekmon's voice was tight with strain as he reported the loss of another squad to the invisible enemies that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. Your soldiers are very impressive warriors, Harrison acknowledged. Their equipment is superior to anything we can field in direct combat. But they have one critical weakness. They were trained to fight other soldiers like themselves. They have no experience dealing with an enemy that refuses to engage on their terms. Kextar activated his communication system to contact his ground forces. All units, report current status. The responses came in one by one, and each report was worse than the last. Units trapped in defensive positions. Supply lines cut. Communication relays destroyed by precisely placed explosives. Soldiers picked off one by snipers who struck from impossible ranges and vanished before return fire could be directed at their positions. Ow! Kextar asked simply. Harrison smiled grimly. Admiral, let me tell you about human warfare. For thousands of years, we've been developing techniques for fighting enemies with superior technology, superior numbers, and superior firepower. We call it asymmetric warfare, and we've had a very long time to perfect it. The general gestured again, and the transmission showed a new image. Human soldiers in elaborate camouflage, barely visible even when Kextar knew where to look. Their weapons appeared primitive by Zephyrian standards, but they were being used with lethal efficiency. Your soldiers were powered armor that makes them strong and nearly invulnerable to our weapons. But that same armor also makes them heavy, noisy, and dependent on power sources that can be targeted. Your sensors can detect energy signatures and thermal emissions, but they struggle with targets that generate neither. As Harrison spoke, the display showed human fighters moving through the urban environment like ghosts. They used sewers, subway tunnels, building interiors, and rooftops to approach their targets unseen. Their weapons were chemical propellant rifles, primitive by galactic standards, but deadly accurate in trained hands. Your tactical doctrine assumes that you will face an enemy that will try to match your superior firepower with their own. But what if the enemy doesn't try to match your strength? What if they instead exploit your weaknesses? Kextar watched in growing horror as the display showed the systematic destruction of his ground forces. The humans weren't engaging in direct combat. They were using hit-and run tactics, ambushes, and sabotage. They struck at supply lines, communication equipment, and isolated soldiers, then melted away before reinforcements could arrive. Every building in our cities has been prepared, Harrison continued. Hidden passages, concealed weapons caches, escape routes, and killing fields. We've had 60 years to turn our own urban environments into the most elaborate trap systems ever constructed. The general paused, letting that information sink in. Admiral, in our history, technologically superior forces have been defeated many times by inferior opponents who understood the terrain and were willing to fight unconventionally. Your invasion force is experiencing what we call urban warfare, combat in an environment that we control completely and that you don't understand at all. Kextar realized with growing dread that everything about this invasion was wrong. The Zephyrian Empire had succeeded in their previous conquests because they had always faced enemies who tried to fight them on equal terms. But these humans seemed to understand that equal terms favored the more advanced force, so they had deliberately chosen to fight on unequal terms instead. "You cannot hide forever," Kextar said, though even he could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "We will adapt to your tactics." Harrison's expression grew even more grim. "Admiral, let me ask you another question. How many soldiers did you deploy for this invasion?" 50,000 elite shock troopers, Kextar replied automatically. "And how many humans do you think are participating in the resistance?" Kextar checked his intelligence reports. "Our estimates suggested a total planetary population of approximately 7 billion, with perhaps 10 million individuals of military age and capability." "Wrong," Harrison said simply. "Every human on this planet has been preparing for this day their entire lives. Every man, woman, and child over the age of 12 has been trained in basic resistance techniques. We have 7 billion soldiers, Admiral. 7 billion people who know this terrain intimately and who have spent decades learning how to fight an enemy exactly like you." The implications of that statement hit Kextar like a physical blow. The Zephyrian Empire was facing not just a military force, but an entire species that had been converted into a resistance movement. "Your 50,000 soldiers are outnumbered 14,000 to 1, Harrison continued relentlessly. "And every single one of those 14,000 enemies knows exactly where your soldiers are, while your soldiers can't find any of them." As if to emphasize the point, another report came in from the surface. Captain Zekmon's unit was down to 37 soldiers and completely surrounded. Their ammunition was running low, their armor's power systems were being drained by constant combat, and they had no hope of reaching any extraction point. "This is impossible," Vishka whispered. "No species could coordinate resistance on this scale." Harrison heard him and smiled coldly. "Commander, let me introduce you to something called the Internet." The display shifted to show a vast network of communication nodes spread across the globe. Every human on the planet is connected to every other human through an instantaneous communication network. When your soldiers moved into position in New York, humans in Tokyo were tracking their movements and relaying tactical information to resistance cells worldwide. Kextar stared at the display in growing horror. The network was unlike anything in Zephyrian experience. Not a military communication system that could be targeted and destroyed, but a civilian infrastructure so distributed and redundant that eliminating it would require destroying the planet's entire technological base. "In the time we've been talking," Harrison continued, "approximately 60 million humans have been tracking this conversation, analyzing your ship's communication protocols, and working collectively to develop countermeasures against your technology. Admiral, you're not just fighting our military, you're fighting our entire civilization." The general stood up and walked closer to the camera. "I'm going to give you 12 hours to evacuate all of your personnel from our planet and withdraw your fleet from our system. If you do so, no human ship will pursue you, and this incident will be forgotten. If you refuse, you'll discover just how creative 7 billion humans can be when they're motivated to defend their home." The transmission ended, leaving Admiral Kextar staring at a blank screen. For the first time in his military career, he found himself facing an enemy that seemed to understand warfare better than he did. The humans had turned the entire concept of planetary conquest on its head by refusing to fight the kind of war the Zephyrian Empire was designed to win. As reports continued to pour in from his beleaguered ground forces, Kextar began to realize that the Empire might have finally encountered a species that couldn't be conquered using conventional tactics. The humans had spent generations preparing for this moment, and they had prepared very well indeed. Admiral Kextar had faced many difficult decisions during his military career, but none quite like this. The 12-hour deadline given by the human general was rapidly approaching, and the situation on the planet's surface had deteriorated beyond anything in his experience. In the past 18 hours, he had lost over 30,000 soldiers, more than half his invasion force, without achieving a single strategic objective. Sir, Commander Vishka approached hesitantly. The Governing Council is requesting an immediate status report. Kextar's stomach clenched. The Governing Council of the Zephyrian Empire did not accept failure gracefully. To report that an entire invasion force had been defeated by primitives armed with chemical weapons would be career-ending at best. At worst, it would result in his execution for incompetence. Delay them, he ordered. Tell them we are conducting detailed tactical analysis before providing our report. But even as he spoke, Kextar knew that delay would only make things worse. The Empire expected swift, decisive victories. Every hour that passed without a successful conquest would raise more questions about his competence as a military commander. Sir, the communications officer called out urgently. We're receiving multiple transmissions from the surface. It's not our forces. The humans again? No, sir. These appear to be different. Kextar activated the main display and found himself looking at something that made his blood run cold. The screen showed dozens of different feeds from around the planet, each one broadcasting what appeared to be human civilians. But these weren't panicked refugees or desperate resistance fighters. They were calm, organized, and clearly following some kind of coordinated plan. One feed showed a group of humans in white coats standing in what appeared to be a laboratory. Another showed individuals in blue uniforms working at complex electronic equipment. A third displayed humans in green clothing operating sophisticated machinery in what looked like an underground manufacturing facility. Admiral Kextar. A voice spoke in perfect Zephyrian, startling everyone on the bridge. The speaker was an elderly human female with gray hair and piercing blue eyes. I am Dr. Elena Vasquez, director of the Human Xenological Defense Initiative. I think it's time you understood exactly who you're fighting. More threats, Kextar demanded, though he could hear the uncertainty in his own voice. Not threats, Admiral. Education. Dr. Vasquez gestured, and the display split to show dozens of different scenes from around the human planet. You see, while your empire was conquering primitive worlds, we've been preparing for the day when we would face a technologically superior enemy. We've spent the last 60 years doing something that apparently no other species has ever done. We've studied you. The display showed what appeared to be a massive archive filled with data on dozens of alien species. Kextar recognized technical specifications for Zephyrian ships, weapons, and armor systems. But the information was far more detailed than anything that should have been available to a species that had never encountered the Empire before. How did you obtain this information? He asked. Admiral, do you remember the conquest of Kepler? 442 b approximately 15 years ago. Kextar did remember. The planet had been inhabited by a species of amphibious beings who had put up surprisingly effective resistance before finally being overwhelmed. But what did that have to do with Earth? The Keplerians had been transmitting radio signals into space for decades before your arrival. Dr. Vasquez continued. We received and decoded many of those transmissions. When their signals suddenly stopped, we knew what had happened to them. But more importantly, in their final transmissions, they managed to send us detailed information about your ships, your weapons, and your tactics. The implications hit Kextar like a physical blow. The humans have been receiving intelligence about the Empire's military capabilities for years, possibly decades. They hadn't been preparing for a hypothetical alien invasion. They had been preparing specifically for invasion by the Zephyrian Empire. That's impossible, Vishka whispered. The Keplerians were primitives. They barely had spaceflight capability. Dr. Vasquez smiled coldly. Commander, you're making the same mistake your empire always makes. You equate technological advancement with intelligence. The Keplerians may have had primitive technology, but they were extremely intelligent, and they wanted very badly to prevent what happened to them from happening to other species. The display shifted to show technical schematics that made Kekstar's heart skip a beat. The humans had detailed plans for Zephyrian ship designs, complete with identified weaknesses and vulnerabilities. They knew about the Empire's military doctrine, their standard invasion procedures, and their technological limitations. We've had 15 years to develop countermeasures, Admiral. 15 years to prepare for exactly this scenario. As if to demonstrate her point, warning alarms suddenly began sounding throughout the Crimson Fawn. Kekstar spun toward his tactical officer, who was staring at his display in confusion. Sir, we're detecting massive energy signatures from the planet's surface. Multiple launch events. Missile. Unknown, sir. The energy patterns don't match any known weapon system. Kekstar activated the external visual display and felt his blood freeze. Rising from the planet's surface were dozens of objects that defied easy classification. They weren't missiles in any conventional sense. They appeared to be small spacecraft, but their design was unlike anything in Zephyrian experience. Admiral, Dr. Vasquez's voice continued calmly from the speakers. I'd like you to meet the Earth Defense Interceptors. We've been building them in underground facilities for the past 12 years, based on detailed analysis of your ship designs. The approaching craft were sleek, angular vessels that seemed to shimmer and shift as they moved through space. They were much smaller than Zephyrian fighters, but they moved with an agility that was almost impossible to track. Sir, the tactical officer reported, his voice tight with strain, I'm having difficulty maintaining target locks. Their hulls appear to be designed to scatter our sensor beams. How many? Kekstar demanded. I count 147. No, that's not right. The count keeps changing. Sir, I think some of these craft are decoys. All of them are real, Admiral. Dr. Vasquez corrected him. But they're using adaptive camouflage systems designed specifically to confuse Zephyrian targeting computers. We reverse-engineered the technology from captured sensor readings of your previous battles. Kekstar watched in growing alarm as the human interceptors approached his fleet. They moved in complex, three-dimensional patterns that seemed almost organic in their fluidity. No formation flying, no predictable attack vectors. Each craft appeared to be operating independently, while somehow maintaining perfect coordination with the others. Launch fighters, he ordered, full defensive formation. But, as his pilots deployed to meet the human attack, Kekstar quickly realized that this engagement would be unlike any space battle the Empire had ever fought. The human craft didn't attack in waves or formations like conventional fighters. Instead, they scattered throughout the battle space, engaging his ships with tactics that seemed to change constantly. Sir, his flight commander reported over the communication system. These craft are using weapons we don't recognize. They appear to be firing some kind of kinetic projectiles, but they're moving at significant fractions of light speed. Kinetic weapons? In space combat, Kekstar had never heard of such a thing. Energy weapons were far more efficient in the vacuum of space, offering greater range and accuracy. But as he watched his fighters engaging the human interceptors, he began to understand the tactical advantage of the primitive weapons. They're not generating energy signatures when they fire, his tactical officer reported. Our defensive systems can't predict where the shots are coming from. On the display, Kekstar could see Zephyrian fighters exploding as streams of hypervelocity projectiles tore through their hulls. The human weapons seemed primitive, but they were devastatingly effective against ships designed to defend against energy weapons. Sir, Dr. Vasquez's voice continued over the speakers. Your ships are very impressive, but they have the same weakness as your ground forces. They're designed to fight enemies who use the same technologies and tactics that you do. We don't. As the space battle raged around his fleet, Kekstar realized that the humans had done something unprecedented in galactic history. They had studied a superior enemy and developed technologies and tactics specifically designed to exploit that enemy's weaknesses. It was a level of strategic thinking that went far beyond what the Empire had encountered from any other species. Admiral, Commander Vishka said urgently, "We've lost 40% of our fighter complement. The human craft they're not fighting like any enemy we've faced before." Kextar could see what his second-in-command meant. The human interceptors were using the entire volume of space around the fleet as their battleground. They attacked from above, below, and all sides simultaneously, never staying in one position long enough for the Zephyrian gunners to establish target locks. Their movements were unpredictable, almost random, but the results were anything but random. "They're hurting us," he realized aloud. "They're forcing our ships into specific positions." Even as he spoke, Kextar could see the pattern developing. The human attack wasn't just about destroying his ships. It was about maneuvering his entire fleet into a predetermined formation. But why? His question was answered a few minutes later when new contacts appeared on the tactical display. These weren't the small, agile interceptors that had been harassing his fleet. These were much larger vessels, appearing from what seemed like empty space. "Stealth ships," he whispered. "They've been waiting in position this entire time." The human stealth vessels were massive compared to their interceptors, and their hulls bristled with weapon systems that defied easy classification. Some appeared to be more kinetic launchers, but others generated energy signatures unlike anything in Zephyrian experience. "Admiral," Dr. Vasquez said, and Kextar could hear the steel in her voice, "these are our heavy cruisers. We've built 12 of them over the past decade, each one specifically designed to engage Zephyrian capital ships. Would you like to see how effective they are?" Before Kextar could respond, the human heavy cruisers opened fire. But instead of the energy beams or plasma bolts he expected, they launched what appeared to be clouds of small objects that moved toward his ships at tremendous speed. "Swarm munitions," his tactical officer reported in a voice tight with panic. Thousands of small projectiles, each one independently guided. Kextar watched in horror as the clouds of projectiles engulfed his ships. Each individual projectile was tiny, probably not much larger than a human fist, but there were so many of them that his defensive systems couldn't possibly target them all. They struck his ship's hulls like a mechanical storm, overwhelming shields and armor through sheer numbers. "The dreadnought Iron Claw is reporting massive hull breaches," Vishka reported. "They're losing atmosphere on multiple decks." "How is this possible?" Kextar demanded. "Those projectiles are too small to penetrate our armor." "Admiral," Dr. Vasquez replied, "those projectiles aren't designed to penetrate your armor. They're designed to burrow into it and then detonate. We call them hull miners. Each one carries a small-shaped charge that can penetrate several inches of durasteel before exploding." As she spoke, Kextar could see secondary explosions rippling across the hulls of his ships as the human ammunition did exactly what its creator described. Thousands of tiny holes were being blown in his ship's armor, weakening their structural integrity and compromising their defensive systems. "Sir," the communications officer called out, "I'm receiving surrender requests from 4 of our ships. They're reporting catastrophic damage and requesting permission to abandon ship." Kextar stared at the tactical display in disbelief. In the space of 30 minutes, his invasion fleet had been reduced from 18 capital ships to barely a dozen functional vessels. The humans had used tactics and technologies that no Zephyrian military planner had ever conceived of, turning every advantage of superior technology into a liability. "Admiral," Dr. Vasquez's voice carried a note of finality, "I believe your 12 hours are up. Are you ready to discuss terms for your withdrawal, or would you prefer to continue this demonstration of human defensive capabilities?" Kextar looked around his bridge at the faces of his crew. For the first time in his career, he could see fear in their expressions. Not just fear of death in battle, but fear of an enemy they didn't understand and couldn't predict. The humans had done something that no other species in galactic history had accomplished. They had taken a technologically inferior position and, used it to achieve tactical superiority through pure intelligence and preparation. They had turned the Empire's own strengths against them, and they had done it with a level of coordination and planning that suggested capabilities far beyond anything the Empire had previously encountered. For the first time in the history of the Zephyrian Empire, Admiral Kextar found himself in command of a defeated fleet. The question now was whether he would be smart enough to recognize that defeat before it became annihilation. Admiral Kextar stood in the center of his bridge, watching his proud invasion fleet being systematically dismantled by an enemy he had underestimated so completely that the failure would haunt him for the rest of his life. The tactical displays showed a situation that no Zephyrian military academy had ever prepared him for, a technologically superior force being defeated by an inferior one through pure tactical brilliance. "Sir," Commander Vishka approached with obvious reluctance, "the Governing Council is demanding an immediate report. They're threatening to send an investigation fleet if we don't respond within the next hour." Kextar closed his eyes and tried to imagine explaining this situation to the Empire's leadership. How could he make them understand that every assumption they held about galactic warfare had just been proven wrong by a species they had dismissed as primitive? "Admiral," Dr. Vasquez's voice cut through his thoughts, "I'm detecting additional Zephyrian vessels entering our system. Are you calling for reinforcements?" Kextar checked his long-range sensors and felt his heart sink even further. 3 more Empire ships were indeed approaching. Not reinforcements he had called for, but an investigation fleet sent by the Council to determine why his invasion was taking longer than expected. "Those ships are not under my command," he admitted. "I see." There was a pause before Dr. Vasquez continued. "Admiral, let me be very clear about something. The forces you've encountered so far represent approximately 15% of Earth's total defensive capability. We have been deliberately restraining ourselves to give you the opportunity to withdraw peacefully. If those ships attempt to engage in hostile action against our world, we will demonstrate the remaining 85%. The threat was delivered in the same calm, professional tone that the human had maintained throughout their conversation, which somehow made it infinitely more terrifying than any amount of shouting or bluster would have been. "What do you want?" Kextar asked simply. "Admiral, I want you to understand something that your empire has apparently never learned. There are different types of intelligence, and technological advancement is only one of them. Humans have spent our entire existence fighting wars against other humans, beings with identical technology, identical physical capabilities, and identical access to resources. Do you know what determines victory in that kind of warfare?" Kextar remained silent. "Pure strategic thinking," Dr. Vasquez answered her own question. "The ability to see patterns, predict enemy behavior, and develop countermeasures faster than your opponent can develop new strategies. For thousands of years, human military leaders have been selected and trained based on their ability to outthink enemies who were their equals in every other respect." The display shifted to show scenes from throughout human history. Ancient battles, medieval sieges, modern conflicts, each one demonstrating tactical innovations that had shifted the balance of power between roughly equal forces. "Your empire has never faced that kind of opposition," she continued. "You've conquered species that were either technologically inferior or who tried to match your strength with equivalent strength. You've never encountered an enemy that refused to fight on your terms." As if to emphasize her point, new contacts began appearing on the tactical display. More human ships were emerging from concealment throughout the system, not just around Earth, but positioned near asteroids, gas giant moons, and other locations that provided strategic advantages. "How long have you been planning this?" Kextar asked. "Admiral, the first human military strategist began planning for this conflict in 1961, when we received our first confirmed radio transmission from an intelligent extraterrestrial source. Every subsequent military planner has contributed to and refined the strategy. We have literally had generations of our best military minds working on the problem of how to defeat a technologically superior space-based invasion force. The scope of the preparation was beyond anything Kextar could have imagined. This wasn't a desperate defense mounted in response to invasion. This was a carefully orchestrated plan that had been in development for longer than most Zephyrian soldiers had been alive. The approaching ships, Dr. Vasquez said, apparently monitoring the same sensor readings that Kextar was watching, will reach the edge of our defensive perimeter in approximately 20 minutes. I need to know whether they intend to engage in hostile action. Kextar activated his communication system and attempted to contact the incoming vessels. Investigation Fleet Alpha. This is Admiral Kextar. Do not approach the third planet. Maintain position at the edge of the system. The response came back immediately in the arrogant tone that Kextar remembered all too well from his own younger days. Admiral, this is Commander Hexval of the Investigation Fleet. You are ordered to provide an immediate status report. Why has this primitive world not yet been secured? Before Kextar could respond, he watched in horror as the approaching ships changed course toward Earth, apparently interpreting his warning as evidence that he had lost control of the situation and needed to be relieved of command. Dr. Vasquez, he said urgently, those ships are not following my orders. Their commander believes I have been compromised and is moving to complete the invasion. Understand, Admiral. Thank you for the warning. What happened next would be remembered in human history as the Battle of Luna, though it lasted less than 12 minutes. The three ships of Investigation Fleet Alpha approached Earth with all the confidence of a force that had never experienced defeat. They had reviewed Admiral Kextar's tactical reports and concluded that he had simply been too cautious in dealing with primitive resistance. The human response was swift, decisive, and utterly devastating. The first indication that something was wrong came when the Investigation Fleet sensors began detecting massive energy signatures from the direction of Earth's moon. But the readings made no sense. They showed power outputs equivalent to a small star, coming from what their intelligence reports had indicated was a barren airless satellite. Admiral, Commander Hexval's voice crackled over the communication system. Are you receiving these energy readings from the fourth moon? Luna, Kextar corrected automatically. The humans call it Luna. Before Hexval could respond, the source of the energy readings became terrifyingly clear. The moon itself was opening. What the Zephyrians had taken for natural crater formations on the lunar surface were revealed to be camouflage covers for the largest weapons systems ever constructed. Sections of the moon's crust slid aside to reveal massive accelerator arrays that stretched for hundreds of kilometers beneath the surface. My God, Dr. Vasquez's voice whispered over the communication channel. I never thought we'd actually have to use the Luna defense grid. The weapons that emerged from a moon's surface defied easy description. They weren't conventional energy weapons or missile systems, but something entirely different. Massive electromagnetic accelerators that had been built directly into the moon structure. They had been constructed over decades by mining equipment and industrial robots, hidden beneath the lunar surface where orbital reconnaissance would never detect them. They weaponized their moon, Vishka said in a voice filled with awe and terror. The Luna defense grid fired exactly once. The projectiles weren't sophisticated missiles or energy bolts, but simple pieces of lunar rock accelerated to a significant fraction of the speed of light by the massive electromagnetic systems hidden beneath the moon's surface. Each projectile massed several tons and struck with the force of a nuclear weapon. Investigation Fleet Alpha ceased to exist in under 30 seconds. Admiral, Dr. Vasquez's voice was heavy with regret. I'm sorry about your people. We gave them multiple warnings to maintain distance, but they didn't respond. That weapon system was built as a last resort against an invasion fleet, and your ships were moving into attack formation. Kextar stared at the empty space where 3 Zephyrian capital ships had been just moments before. The Luna defense grid had fired with such precision and power that there wasn't even debris left behind. The ships had been completely vaporized by the impact. How? He asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. 60 years of preparation, Admiral. We hollowed out approximately 30% of our moon's interior, and filled it with the largest weapons system ever constructed. Every piece was built using resources mined from the moon itself, so there was never any sign of the construction from Earth's surface or from space. The implications were staggering. The humans had not only prepared for alien invasion, they had prepared for the possibility that their initial defense might fail, and they would need weapons capable of destroying an entire invasion fleet. The Luna defense grid represented a level of long-term strategic planning that went far beyond anything the Empire had ever encountered. The choice is now yours, Admiral, Dr. Vasquez continued. You can withdraw your remaining ships from our system and report to your Empire that Earth is not a suitable target for conquest. Or you can attempt to continue this invasion and discover exactly what other preparations we've made. Kextar looked around his bridge one more time, taking in the faces of his crew. These were veteran soldiers who had participated in dozens of successful conquests. But now they were looking to him with expressions that mixed fear, confusion, and a dawning recognition that they were facing something unprecedented. All ships, he broadcast to his remaining fleet, withdraw to safe distance and prepare for departure. Sir, Vishka asked uncertainly. The Empire will demand an explanation for our failure. Then we will give them one, Kextar replied firmly. We will tell them that we encountered a species that has evolved beyond the Empire's understanding of warfare. We will recommend that Earth be classified as a protected world, and that no further attempts at conquest be authorized. As his battered fleet began its withdrawal from the human system, Kextar found himself thinking about the conversation he would soon have with the Governing Council. How could he explain that the Empire's entire military doctrine had been revealed as fundamentally flawed by a species they had dismissed as primitive? Admiral, Dr. Vasquez's voice came over the communication system one final time. I want you to understand that this doesn't have to be the end of contact between our species. Humans are generally peaceful by nature. We only fight when we're threatened. If your Empire is willing to approach us as equals rather than as conquerors, we would be happy to establish diplomatic relations. Kextar considered her words carefully. Dr. Vasquez, I will carry that message to my superiors. But I must warn you, the Empire does not handle rejection well. There will likely be others who attempt what I have failed to accomplish. We understand, Admiral. We'll be ready for them. As the Zephyrian fleet departed the solar system, Kextar began composing his report to the Governing Council. He would tell them about a species that had turned preparation into an art form, that had spent generations developing strategies specifically designed to defeat technologically superior enemies. He would explain how the humans had refused to fight the kind of war that the Empire was designed to win, instead forcing them to fight on human terms. Most importantly, he would recommend that the Zephyrian Empire recognize that their age of easy conquest was over. Humanity had demonstrated that technological superiority could be overcome by strategic superiority, and other species throughout the galaxy would undoubtedly study and learn from human tactics. The Empire would have to adapt or face the possibility of future defeats against enemies who had learned to fight like humans. As Admiral Kextar looked back at the blue-green world that had humbled the most powerful military force in known space, he realized that humanity had just changed the nature of galactic warfare forever. The age of the humans had begun.